Oscar here talking about Project 1, Phase 1. The purpose of this stage is to generate just what the idea is that you're going after and all the cultural references and media influences that should inform that decision. We're going to start with a single sentence description of your plot and maybe a title. And we're then going to create a mind map of anything that could possibly be connected to that. The mind map will then inform a mood board that we generate in PureRef that's going to have pictures of any sort of thing that might inform this. The goal of this is that once we take that to the next stage and start developing some of these ideas into a rough composition, we should never be at a loss for what we need next. If you're wondering all of a sudden, what do elephants look like? I need to draw an elephant. That should be somewhere in your mood board. If you're wondering, what sort of clothing would a Victorian noble wear, that should be somewhere in your mood board. And you'll know that you need Victorian noblewomen because it was somewhere in your mind map. Now this is a pretty well-developed mind map that I created, and it starts with just a title and an elevator pitch. An elevator pitch should be short and sweet. The idea is that if you suddenly got into an elevator with the CEO of Disney or Valve or something, and you had one elevator ride to explain your idea so they can hand you a big pile of cash, you're not rambling. So my idea is based around my daughter wearing a hearing aid, and the idea is that a schoolgirl is out on the playground and her hearing aid helps her communicate with the robot. She needs to team up with this robot and fight off the cosmic space monsters attacking the school playground. So here you can see a finished mind map of how I generated this. I start from just a Photoshop document. And I use an 11 by 17. I write out my title and a rough pitch. And I start coming up with categories such as environment, characters, inspiration, reference, pipeline ideas, culture. And from here, I just let my mind flow. Any sort of idea that could come into play, I try and map that out. For instance, on the culture side, it's sort of just in every town in the USA, and a lot of this is going to be taking place from the perspective of children on the playground. I want to make sure that I'm using children, so not teenagers. It shouldn't be edgy kids. It should still be that playground land where everyone's playing make-believe. The media inspiration can include a lot of things, such as cartoons that have involved children in it before, like Recess or Calvin and Hobbes or Pepper Ann, and also things that just have stylish ideas that I like, such as Teen Titans. On the pipeline side, I'm thinking about how will I cut costs and make sure that this can actually be animated with a design that works. So for instance, on something like Gumball, you'll see like the character has this body and the legs go behind it. How can I use like baggy sweatshirts or skirts on children to make sure that I don't have to animate legs? There's no wrong answers here. The more stuff you write down, the better. Again, this should eventually inform things in your mood board. So anything that I write down here is something I'm going to go and try and find images for. On the environment, I think about playground equipment. For the characters, I map out my major ideas, such as the schoolgirl, the robot, and the aliens that are attacking, as well as classmates and the teacher. What's going to inform that? It could be something that comes off the characters. It can be something that comes off the reference. Now that you have all this developed, the next stage is to take it into PureRef and we start looking for these things. At this point, you should have a complete mind map with anything that could be related to the intellectual property that you're starting to build the world around. This is mostly focused on your genre and your culture, but it can include other things such as ideas for characters, environment. I look at things like reference, pipeline, and I even look at like TV tropes to figure out what other things are out there that my thing is going to be similar to. From there, you can continuously map things out, and this is going to give you everything you need for the next stage, which is creating a mood board. All you have to do for that is start looking up images that might relate to anything in one of these little bubbles. Now once you have this, you're going to go to pureref.com and download PureRef, which is a mood board making tool. This is free, and all you have to do is enter 0 for the custom amount. Once you're in PureRef, I recommend copy and paste an image, and you're going to start moving it around. You can also go to the settings and find your hotkeys for PureRef. This is a good reference for using it pretty regularly. The main ones that I use are Control N for note and Control Shift A for overlay. No. Anyways, it's all here. Make sure you just look there. Now, as you're downloading these images and putting them in, you can hit Control N to create a note and label them. Notes will be hierarchically arranged. So if you have a note that you create and you then create another note while holding that one or while that object is selected, it'll be hierarchically around there. So you can use this to create a note that says characters and then separate notes for each type of character. Another thing that I like to do is once you have this, you can start holding this as an overlay. You can set it to always on top. And as a result, it's a really handy tool for looking at art or looking at reference while drawing. You don't necessarily have to draw exactly what you're looking at. What we want to end up doing is use this as inspiration. Now, another thing I like to do is I find it really tedious to right-click and save as multiple images and copy and paste and copy and paste. A lot of times you have a single website that has 500 images, all of which kind of relate to your project. What we're going to do is instead use downloadallimages.mobilepfirst.me, which creates this little plugin over here, the zip that you see in my bookmarks bar here, or my header on Chrome. And this creates a little tool where you can click one button and it'll scrape a website for every image that could possibly be pertinent. So now when I look up Playground on Unsplash or Google Images or Pinterest, I can click that button and download all of it to a single giant zip folder. At which point you can right click and extract to a specific destination. This will give you a folder full of images and you just select all of them and drag them into PureRef in one go. Here I am control clicking on these and I drag them in and they all end up in PureRef at once. You can then right click and choose image arrange optimal and it'll make them all even. You can also choose image arrange and normalize, I think. Let me see. Image arrange, no wait, align, no. Image normalize the size and that will make all of the images the same size. I then start moving these around en masse under categories like character, environments, culture, reference images. So I look up all sorts of things. I look up amoebas for my aliens. I look up medical equipment because I think that sort of white plastic look is kind of neat and looks good on a robot. I look up playground equipment. I look up old toys like Gundam Wing and Transformers. Anything and everything is good to have in your PureRef document. Now again, this is a tool for production, and you don't want to spend too much time because you'll find that as you are doing this, you can hit the point where you're spending so much time on PureRef that and looking at reference that you're not actually doing any drawing and you're not actually developing any ideas. So once you have this ready, it's time to start making thumbnails. The third stage of Project 1 is to do some blue sky thumbnailing. This is going to be informed by our mood board, and you're going to try and use very graphic shapes to inform the shape language of things that you can then work up into a more detailed concept. Let's take a look at how to do this in two different programs, Photoshop and Krita. Over here in Photoshop, you can see some of the things that come in the starting project file, which is starting off with this just blank slate. We have some examples from the former instructor. You can see it working from simple shapes, and you start with this very graphic idea, and a lot of this is done with lasso painting. You can then work this up with old-fashioned linear drawing, and eventually you're going to find in these thumbnails your favorite three ideas to work into a rough composition. I like to start off sometimes doing this manually. So this is a version that I did similar to his process, in which I started with just ink blots on a sketchbook. I then took those and tried to turn them into monsters. So that's what we're going to be doing here. Let's start with a new layer. To show you what I'm looking at here, here's a PureRef document with some of the ideas from my idea. It's really sort of, in a nutshell, the genre is science fiction and sort of alien invasion stuff, but combined with a school. So we have stuff in this mood board that I put together that includes just illustration styles I like, but also a lot of
stuff like playgrounds, characters from things that have a lot of kids. And we also have robots and monsters. A lot of the monsters ideas that I went with in my reference started to chase ideas of just abstract amorphous blobs like amoebas and paramecium and stuff you'd see in a microscope. I think a lot of this informs cool aliens, and I want to go sort of in that direction. So let's look at how we can do this in Photoshop. First off, I can have these ideas informing my process while I work by right-clicking and choosing Mode, Always on Top. This will make it so that as I work in Photoshop on this side, or with Photoshop on one side, PureRef will be on the other side. We can also make Photoshop stick to one side of my monitor by using Windows arrow key. So now it's really definitely on one side or the other. I can make this right there. I'm hitting F in Photoshop to make this go full screen. Actually, hold on 1 second. Here in Photoshop, I'm going to choose General Brushes, just the hard round, maybe hard round pressure size. This is going to be the brush I use, but I'm actually going to start with the lasso tool. Now I can have different sections for this or different layers where I think about aliens, main characters, teachers, whatever I'm working with. So the way lasso painting works is a lot of times you just create shapes. You can hold shift to make your selection add or subtract by holding Alt. Now there's multiple ways you can work. On one hand, you can zoom way in on a specific idea that you're looking at. You can also do this as timed intervals. You can also do this as something where you're just using abstract shapes and then you'll figure it out later. There's no requirement that says you have to use something you're directly looking at in PureRef. It's mostly something that you should definitely go and glance at if you just suddenly feel like you don't know what to draw next. When I have a bunch of selections, I'll just hit Alt Backspace to fill with my background color. So for the aliens, I can start thinking about ideas like graphic shapes, and also combine this with my brush get ideas of like, how do I want these to work? Maybe I want these to be more limb-like. Are they going to float in the air? Are they going to touch the ground? You should do no more than 30 seconds per idea here. To go back to layers, sometimes what I like doing is you can do something like a new layer that's a solid color. And this will be something where you choose pure black. You can invert the mask. And then as you're working, instead you can just paint with black and white and it's like erasing. So instead of doing that example previously, I could increase my brush size, get some blobs. I kind of like the idea of like maybe these are like really graphic, very bright angled stuff. And I can also paint inside by hitting X to suddenly be painting with my background color. In other words, I'm painting on the mask rather than on the layer. Jump around. Try not to stick with one idea too much. I don't know everything about my robots, for instance, but I do know that I want to have some sort of body. I think I want to have multiple components. So I want to have like the head be separate. I want to get that vibe of, you know, Transformers or Voltron, Gundam Wing. The idea that like, you know, multiple components come together to form this. And then, you know, a robot is just arms and legs. And another thing that's nice about doing this on a solid color layer, it means that I can, instead of filling it, I can just invert the mask. No sticky keys. No. People who are drawing, never ever turn you on. Yeah. Oh no. It doesn't have to be very specific. And try to jump around a lot. I like the Portal robots too. Don't be afraid to also just straight up paint. However, when you're doing that, I would recommend using a Sharpie-like mentality about this. Don't use any brush that has differing levels of value. Try and make sure that it's always just pure black or pure white. So no pen pressure for opacity, because again, we're trying to focus on big shapes here. I kind of like this guy's feet and this sort of swooping motion here. There's also scribble drawing. Sometimes, a lot of times, I've found that when people really struggle with getting ideas out, try to do a single contour line, and you're not allowed to pick your line up. This will help you because you have no choice but to keep going. Very quickly, I have a lot of ideas to work from. And this is important because if you're trying to sell an idea, a lot of times the number one thing that somebody who is working on a project wants is some sort of buy-in on your project. And if you give them 5 ideas and you like uh, one of them, you're going to be really sad when they pick the one that you don't like. The more ideas you have, the more they will feel like they've had shared governance on some sort of media idea, and the more likely it is that you're going to not have emotional attachment to it. So as a result, you're going to be able to incorporate their ideas into this. Maybe this is more of like a multi-legged spider robot. If you run out of space, just create new layers. Let's look at some of the kid drawings as well. I was looking at things like Calvin and Hobbes, X Babies, Yokai Watch. A big part of this idea is sort of that wristwatch culture that you see in a lot of shows, where you have some sort of gadget, and that's the secret to how somebody does whatever they're doing, controlling robots or whatever. Oh no, I think my pen died. Jumping over to Krita, I did want to show some other methods that you can use in another piece of software. Krita is free and open source, which is one of the reasons I recommend it. And honestly, it's one of my favorite things to paint in. It shares a lot of conventions of Photoshop. So if you have an understanding of Photoshop, a lot of things like holding spacebar to pan, uh, brackets to increase or decrease your brush size, all those will pay off. It also has things for um, creating something like the fill layer, which is add a fill layer. Same thing. Here's color. It's stored inside of this. You don't get a thumbnail for the mask. So if I invert this though, same idea. Now when I paint, there it is. Now I'm going to choose pure white for this, and I wanted to recommend this specific brush here. This is the Shapes Fill brush. And the Shapes Fill brush specifically is like a built-in lasso, which I love because sometimes it's just aggravating to have to constantly think in terms of having to turn your lasso from a selection to a brush. So you can see here that I can just immediately jump into this. So You can see how this is a little more direct feedback than Photoshop. And as a result, I can have, uh, it's just a nice tool. I don't know why Photoshop doesn't have this. I mean, Photoshop's like 3 million years old, right? But so now I can think about things for my reference, like how are they using uh, character proportions? How many heads tall are they? I'm thinking that my characters are going to be kind of based on my children, of course. So I'm thinking like kind of fourth grade. Another recommendation I have for this is do not hit undo, because if you could do it in 30 seconds, it's not worth doing it in undo. Also, if you're in Krita, you can just hit X to switch your colors back and forth, just like in Photoshop. And because I'm painting on this fill layer, which has this saved in an alpha, again, you don't get to see it, but it's somewhere in here. That means as I hit X, I can go black, hit X to switch my foreground and background color. It's painting with black here, which in a mask sensibility means off. So it's erasing. So when I switch to white, it's back to adding and then subtracting. Now, part of what we're going for here is we want to be able to understand silhouette right off the bat. So like if there's a bully kid, we need to just understand by silhouette why he's a bully, I also, even though we're at this brainstorming stage, I am thinking about production constraints. So here on Pepper Rain, you can see they have these rubber hose legs. And that is something that in some programs you can make really easy by just having a single spline, a single row of vertices, or a single Bezier curve. And I think about how I want to have that. Again, we're not looking for perfect drawings yet. We're looking for idea generation. So here on this example, where I'm just cribbing notes from Hilda, we can see like the body proportions. It's like 1/3 head, 1/3 body, 1/3 leg. This is going to give me very different results as a character than if I'm looking at something where it's more anatomically correct, like an anime. And so I'm trying to think about style. I'm trying to think about budgetary constraints. I'm trying to think about, my personal identity on this project. How are my cartoon characters going to look? Better or worse? So keep filling up your doodle page with these blue sky ideas. And again, don't be afraid to just make randomness and then figure it out after the fact. Maybe this is a bug monster. Make sure you're incorporating cultural elements into here. So, for my reference, I think somewhere in here, I have a culture section. And I thought a lot about, what kind of culture is this school at? It's sort of default Americana, but, I wanted it to have that sort of grungy, underfunded feeling, kind of like Captain Underpants or Calvin and Hobbes. Classic sort of situations where you would find, bullies, old playgrounds, and really, what you're getting with this is the idea that because the kids are allowed to run wild, they can come across something that's weird and unfamiliar and mysterious. I'm also thinking about the robots as a culture and how did I want them to look. I thought a lot about, 1950s to 1970s Monaco, a global community where the mysterious and super rich might come and have intriguing conflicts, such as, the specific thing that came to mind is like post World War II Nazi hunting. Like, where are they hiding, and what kind of person is going around finding those? Because theoretically, it's aliens versus robots. And I started finding in my research things like this great graphic design, or these classic race cars, and how can I incorporate that into my robots? Get the ideas flowing. You need at least 20, and from there, you're going to work up your rough compositions of your favorite three.
After you've got your thumbnails in place, you can start making a rough comp or comprehensive. This means that it's a version that has sort of all the elements in place. I take a couple of my favorites over here, and you can see how we're still dealing primarily with shape language and black and white silhouettes. That's a leading idea for the design. From here, you're going to start drawing on top of it and making a more and more detailed version of it. I do this in a couple of ways. Number one, this layer is at full opacity here, but I set it to multiply. And as I work, I can lower this opacity so that I'm basically tracing on top of this. Another thing I recommend is as you work, don't use undo and don't use erasing. What you should instead do is create new layers. That way, when you draw, what you can do is consider this layer to be several steps all at once. So for instance, if I go in here, I can start by just getting rough lines in place. It doesn't have to be perfect. And as I work, I'm going to occasionally adjust this. This girl has a hearing aid, but I'm going to try and go fast. Now the reason that you don't want to necessarily undo or erase is note how every single one of these steps creates a single brush history state. If I hit undo to get rid of that, it's going to take forever. Much better than that is to use new layers. I can create a new layer with Control-Shift-N in Photoshop or Insert in Krita, and now I can draw on this. A layer, in the same way that undo can represent a series of steps, this layer can represent everything that I do on this single layer. So as I work, maybe I get more rough. I'm not going to be too specific. And while this is a single thing, I can still move it around with the Move tool. At some point, if I have multiples of these, I can start going through and merging them all. And as I work, I can just lower the opacity. So for instance, I'm being pretty rough right now with this as I get this girl's outfit in place. And the reason for that is because at some point, I will take all these and I will make a more refined version of that. This might be in the form of merging all these layers down into a single layer, hitting V for the Move tool, which will make the scope of my hotkeys affect layers rather than brush. And now I'll use the number line to hit 3, and then this is now just lowered opacity. From here, I can start tracing more and more. Now this character has some ideas that for pipeline reasons I really like, such as this simplified Calvin and Hobbes sort of face. And I can continuously use these new layers over and over. Your goal is to eventually get to the point where you have a rough drawing for everything. Now to show an example of this even more, here I've lowered this layer, and at this point, maybe I start going in and I use a more ink-based approach. So I'm going to use the hard round pressure size brush now. Oops, what did I do? I'm going to change the shape dynamics to this so it has a minimum diameter around there. That's going to make it so that I don't get too much wispiness on it. That looks pretty good. And as I work, I'll probably up the smoothing as well. So this is fairly in place now, and now I can start making it really nice and clean if I want. Don't forget that as you work on this, remember to check your reference too. So let's get PureRef up and running. And I want to have that in place as well as I work. You can hide this grid by hitting Control F. Now, an inked line drawing is not necessarily the way that you have to approach this. You might prefer something that's a little more painterly, a little more soft. A lot of what I'm doing at this point is taking this initial drawing and on these new subsequent layers, correcting it a little bit at a time. Give kitty cat ears. When I load up my PureRef for this, I can start looking at things like what my influences are. And I try and use PureRef as a back and forth. Sometimes it can tell you exactly what you can put in there as almost like an art director. A lot of times I wait until I'm having artist's block. If I don't know what to draw next, I might go in and check here. So like for instance, see these spokes around the wheels? That's a perfect thing to include over here for the leg joints that I've got. So I'm going to use mode, always on top. And I can think about how these wheels attach to the car. When I go in and do something like render this sort of chassis for where the leg comes in. See things like right around here where it has these little pistons. That's the sort of thing where looking at that, I can just think, well, I don't know what to put in this leg. But your reference does. Here I am undoing. Not even following my own advice. I wanted to black it out. Another thing that I do a lot is I love painting on fill layers. Now to show you a fill layer, here it is on the layers for Photoshop. You can also find this in Krita, and when I do this, it creates a solid color. I'm going with black right now, and it has a mask for this layer. The mask represents where it shows up and where it doesn't show up. I'm going to invert this so that nothing is on this layer. Now the benefit of this is now I don't have to think about erasing in the same way. I can think of this as on or off, black or white. So for instance, right now, I'm going to go down to this previous layer. Where was it? Where was I doing these inks beforehand? There we are. So here, the problem with this is if I ever did want to erase something, it's not I have to switch tools and it's on a different setup. And when I want to erase something, I can't necessarily just use the same brush. By painting on a mask here instead, I can create this wherever I need. So as I paint, I can, I'm going to switch back to the brush. I can use my brush here, and when I'm painting on white, that is telling the mask yes or on. Now when I switch it to black, it turns off. So for instance, here I can do this, and I can just black this whole thing as it goes over there. And now I can hit X to switch colors, and it switches. I love this because it turns it all into something of a single interface. And don't be afraid to just collapse all these layers at once while you work on them. Now I want you to make sure that you're jumping around and not over rendering on this, because this is a rough composition still, and in class we're going to get feedback on what needs to change still. Switch to the layer, not the mask. So make sure you don't over render, because you need to have some wiggle room for what's going to change. By the end of this, I should have at least 3 of these drawn up into a more complete version so that we can start working on value options and incorporating class feedback.